My father tapped the microphone twice at my brother's rehearsal dinner and said, loud enough for the whole room to hear, "And here she is, the one who couldn't even finish college. Say hi to the family charity case." The room laughed. Not everyone, but enough. My brother's fiancée looked away. My mother studied the centerpiece on the table like it held the secret to surviving the next 30 seconds. My brother, the groom, the golden one, the reason we were all gathered in that rented ballroom in downtown Chicago on a Thursday night, smiled the way he always smiled when my father said something that should have been private but wasn't, comfortable, unbothered, like he'd heard it so many times it had become background noise. I didn't flinch. I'd learned not to, a long time ago. What my father didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I owned the building we were standing in, not the event space, the entire building, all 14 floors. I had purchased it 18 months earlier through one of my holding companies during a quiet acquisition that made a small note in a commercial real estate publication that nobody in my family read. The rehearsal dinner venue was a tenant, one of dozens. I had approved the lease renewal myself, sitting in my office on the 22nd floor of a different building 3 blocks away, without once thinking that my brother would choose this particular space for his celebration. Coincidence has a sense of humor. I stood there in my dress, simple dark green, chosen because I wanted to blend in, not because I couldn't afford better, and I let my father's joke settle over the room. I had lived inside that joke my entire life. I knew its shape. I knew how it moved and where it landed and which people would laugh and which would go quiet out of politeness or discomfort or some private recognition of their own. What I didn't know yet was that the night wasn't over. The event coordinator, a woman named Patricia who had worked in that building for 6 years and knew exactly who signed her company's lease, had been standing near the entrance when my father made his remark. I didn't see her face in that moment. I learned about it later. I was told she went very still, the way people do when they've heard something that contradicts everything they understand about a situation, and then she looked at me with an expression I can only imagine, because I wasn't watching her. I was watching my father, the way I had always watched my father, trying to understand how a man who called himself a good parent could be so careless with his own child. Patricia walked to my side sometime around the 3rd course. She leaned down, quiet and professional, and asked if I wanted her to make an announcement. I told her no. I told her the evening could continue exactly as planned. She looked at me for a moment. Then she nodded and she walked away, and I went back to my salad and my father told another joke, and my brother laughed, and my mother found something else to study, and the night moved forward the way nights in my family always moved forward, with me somewhere at the edge of it, present but not counted. But Patricia, it turned out, had already made a call. I should start from the beginning. My father is a man who believes in legacies. He grew up without money, built a decent life through his 30 years in commercial insurance, and decided somewhere along the way that the most important thing a man could do was pass something down. He had 2 children to pass things down to. He looked at my brother and he saw himself, driven, charming, comfortable in rooms full of men who made decisions. He looked at me and he saw a question he didn't know how to answer. I was not a difficult child. I was quiet, which my father interpreted as meekness. I was careful, which he interpreted as timidity. I read constantly, which he found vaguely suspicious. I asked questions about money, about how it worked, where it went, why some families had it and others didn't. And he waved me off the way you wave off a cat that's wandered onto the wrong piece of furniture. Not unkindly, just without any real attention. My brother Nathan was 4 years older and had been shaped by my father's attention the way clay gets shaped by the only hands that ever touch it. He was easy in the way that boys who have never been doubted are easy. Loose in his confidence, generous with his opinions, certain that the room would arrange itself around him because it always had. I don't think he was cruel by instinct. He had simply never been asked to consider anyone's experience but his own. I remember the first time I understood the difference. I was 11 years old. Nathan was 15. My father had been invited to give a presentation to his company's regional leadership team, and he spent 2 weeks preparing for it at the kitchen table. He talked to Nathan about it every night, about persuasion, about how to read a room, about the importance of opening with a story that made people feel something. He let Nathan sit in on his practice runs and asked for his feedback. I sat at the same table doing homework. I was never asked. The night of the presentation, my father took Nathan to the office with him. He told my mother it was good for a boy Nathan's age to see how business worked. He didn't look at me when he said it. Not even sideways. I wasn't a consideration. I was just there. I asked my mother later why I hadn't been invited. She said it wasn't really appropriate. She said it in a way that made clear the conversation was over. I was 11. I understood something then that I couldn't have put into words yet, but that settled into me the way understanding settles into children. Without announcement, without drama, just a slow weight that becomes part of how you carry yourself. I was not who he was building for. Nathan was the future. I was furniture. Things continued in this way for years. Nathan's failures were reframed as pivots. When he dropped out of his first semester at Northwestern, my father called it finding his direction. When he borrowed $8,000 from my parents at 23 and never paid it back, no one mentioned it at dinner. When he started a landscaping business that collapsed in 18 months, my father said it showed entrepreneurial spirit. The year I graduated high school with a 4.1 GPA and a partial academic scholarship to the University of Illinois, my father's response was that I should have applied somewhere better. He said it at the kitchen table, over spaghetti, as though he was talking about the weather. I didn't argue. I had already learned that arguments accomplished nothing except to make me feel worse. I put my head down, and I went to school, and I did what I had always done, which was work harder than anyone knew, and say less than I felt. I lasted 2 years at Illinois before I left. Not because I failed. My grades were excellent. My professors were beginning to notice me. One of them had already mentioned a possible research position. I left because I had found something that felt more urgent than a degree. My father never understood this. He announced it to relatives at Christmas like a confession of my failure. "She didn't finish," he said, with the particular tone people use for things that confirm what they already believed. My mother said nothing. Nathan, who had also not finished, said nothing either, but in the self-satisfied way of someone who is relieved the spotlight has landed elsewhere. What I had found was a foreclosed apartment complex on the south side of Chicago. 24 units, most of them empty, the rest occupied by tenants who had been there for decades and were terrified of what the bank would do next. The property had been mismanaged for years, allowed to deteriorate by an owner who stopped caring long before the bank got involved. The numbers were a mess, the building looked worse than they read. I had been working since I was 16, retail jobs, tutoring, a summer at an accounting firm where I discovered that I understood balance sheets in a way that felt almost physical, the way some people understand music. I had saved $11,000 by the time I left Illinois. I had read everything I could find about distressed real estate. I had spent 6 months building a relationship with a private lender I'd found through a real estate investment forum, a woman in her 60s named Barbara who had made her own money buying and rehabilitating properties that nobody else wanted. Barbara agreed to co-sign the loan. I agreed to manage the property myself. We split the equity. I was 20 years old. The next 3 years were the hardest of my life. I learned how to fix a water heater by watching YouTube videos at midnight. I learned how to read a lease, how to negotiate with contractors, how to talk to tenants who were frightened and angry and had every reason to be skeptical of someone who looked as young as I did. I learned that problems didn't wait for convenient times, that emergencies had no interest in my sleep schedule, that the difference between a good property and a failing one was almost always the quality of the attention paid to it. My family knew none of this. When they asked what I was doing, I said I was working in property management. This was accurate. They heard something vague and downwardly mobile, and they filed it away as confirmation of their expectations. I was happy, genuinely, quietly happy, in the way you can only be happy when you are doing something that feels like the truest version of what you are. The South Side complex turned around in 2 years. Barbara and I sold it for a profit that surprised both of us. I rolled my share into a second property, then a third. I brought in a partner, a former contractor named Wesley, who had 20 years of rehabilitation experience and exactly zero patience for excuses, and we began to take on larger projects. Commercial mixed use, a small office building in Pilsen that needed a new roof and new management, a row of storefronts in Bridgeport that the previous owner had let go dark. Wesley handled the physical work. I handled the numbers, the financing, the legal structures, the acquisitions. We complemented each other so completely that the arrangement never felt like work. It felt like something that was supposed to exist. By the time I was 27, we had a portfolio worth $11 million. By the time I was 29, I had bought out Barbara's interest in all our shared properties. She retired to Tucson. I sent her flowers and a bottle of champagne that probably cost more than I'd spent on furniture in my first apartment. I did not tell my family. This was not a strategy. It was not a game. It was simply that they had never asked about my life in any real way, and at some point, the not asking had become its own answer. My father called every few months with updates about Nathan's new job, Nathan's new apartment, Nathan's opinions about things my father found interesting. He would ask how I was doing with the same energy people use to ask about the weather. I would say, fine. He would move on. My mother called more often and with more warmth, but even her warmth was shaped by her husband's framework. She was proud of me, she said, but the pride was always slightly apologetic, slightly hedged, like she was proud of me despite something. I had stopped needing their recognition years before I stopped wanting it. Those are different stages. Wanting came first, and it lasted longer than I'd like to admit. Nathan got engaged to a woman named Courtney in March of last year. The engagement party was at my parents' house in Naperville. I attended with a bottle of wine and my best approximation of family warmth. My father spent the evening telling the story of how Nathan had pulled himself together and built something real. He was in software sales now, making good money, finally on the right track. My mother smiled with her whole face. Nathan shone. I talked to Courtney's mother about a book she'd been reading. It was a nice conversation. I drove home at 10 and was in bed by 11 and had 3 property calls before 9 the next morning. 6 months later, I received the invitation to the rehearsal dinner. I almost didn't go. Not out of resentment, though I'd be lying if I said there wasn't some buried layer of something underneath the practical objections. I almost didn't go because I had a deal closing that week, a $12 million acquisition that required my attention and my presence and my signature on a very large number of documents. Going to Chicago for a Thursday night dinner seemed unnecessary, but she was going to be my sister-in-law, and my mother would have been hurt. And I had learned over the years that the things you skip are harder to recover from than the things you attend and survive. I survived mostly. Until my father's joke, I had chosen the venue myself 2 months earlier through the building's events coordinator, Patricia. I had not made a connection between the property and my family because the property was one of 14. I had approved the lease renewal without registering the specific tenant name as anything significant. The rehearsal dinner venue existed in my mind as a line item. My brother's celebration existed in a different mental space entirely. It was Patricia who connected them when she received the event booking and cross-referenced it with the ownership records in a way I hadn't thought to do. She hadn't said anything. She'd handled the booking professionally, set up the room beautifully, greeted my family with the warmth that made her good at her job. She had watched the evening unfold with a knowledge that nobody in my family possessed. And then my father made his joke. I don't know exactly what Patricia's expression looked like in that moment, but I know what she did next because she told me afterward. She called the building's general manager. His name is Kevin. He's been with the property since I acquired it. He has my cell number and the standing instruction to contact me directly if something requires my attention. He is the kind of person who understands what discretion means and applies it without being asked. Kevin came down to the ballroom about 20 minutes after Patricia's call. He found me at the edge of the room, where I'd spent most of the evening, and he spoke quietly. He said he'd heard there might be some confusion about the building's ownership. He said he wanted to make sure nothing was misrepresented to the event guests. I told him the same thing I'd told Patricia. The evening could continue as planned. He looked at me for a moment. Kevin is in his mid-50s, methodical, not given to sentiment. But there was something in his expression that I recognized, the look of someone who has decided that the truth deserves a witness. "The ownership placard is still up in the lobby," he said, "from the tenant appreciation event last month. The one with your name on it." I remembered the placard. It had been a small celebration for the building's tenants, a nice afternoon event, a catered lunch, a display in the lobby featuring the building's history and the names of its current owners. My name and Wesley's, our company name, a brief note about our acquisition and our investment in the building's rehabilitation. I hadn't thought to take it down. "You might want to walk through the lobby on your way to the restroom," Kevin said. Then he nodded and walked back to wherever he'd come from. My father was deep in conversation with one of Nathan's friends when I excused myself from the table. I walked through the lobby slowly. The placard was exactly where Kevin said it was. A framed display near the elevator bank, not large but perfectly legible. My company name. My name. The words "principal owner" in clear professional print. I looked at it for a moment, then I walked back to the ballroom. I didn't say anything. I didn't plan anything. I sat back down and finished my dinner and said the appropriate things when toasts were made and wished my brother and his fiancée well, with a sincerity that surprised me a little, because it turned out I meant it. It was Nathan who found the placard. He went to the restroom sometime around dessert and came back with a different expression on his face. He leaned over to my father and said something I couldn't hear. My father's face went through a sequence I had never seen on him. Confusion, dismissal, something harder, something that looked almost like recalibration. He looked at me across the table. I looked back. He excused himself and walked to the lobby. He was gone for about 4 minutes. When he came back, he sat down very carefully, the way people sit when they've discovered the ground is less solid than they thought. He didn't say anything for the rest of the dinner. Neither did I. There was nothing to say. The placard said everything in calm, professional language, without drama or confrontation or the kind of satisfaction I might have felt once, years ago, when being recognized by him still mattered. My mother found me as people were gathering their coats. She looked at me in the way she had rarely looked at me, actually looked the way you look at something you've been walking past for years and suddenly see. "I didn't know," she said. "I know," I said. "That's the part I want you to think about." She put her hand on my arm. She didn't say anything else. We stood there for a moment in the way that mothers and daughters sometimes stand, with too much between them to say any of it quickly. Nathan found me in the parking garage 20 minutes later. He had that fragile quality he sometimes had when his certainty was taken out from under him. Not mean, not defensive, just uncertain, like a person who has walked into a room and forgotten why. He asked how long. 9 years, I said. He was quiet. "I want you to understand that I'm not angry at you," I said, "but I want you to understand something. Every room you were ever prepared for, I was standing outside of. Every conversation Dad had with you about building something, I had by myself. Whatever I have, I built it in the hours when nobody was watching and nobody cared. Not because I had to do it that way, because there was no other way available to me." He looked at the ground. He said he didn't know what to say. "You don't have to say anything," I said, "but you should think about it." My father called the next morning, early, before 7, which told me the night had cost him sleep. He said he had clearly underestimated me. He said it the way he said most things, not quite apologetically, not quite directly. He said the words, but kept the feelings at a slight distance, the way people do when they are processing something painful and haven't finished yet. I let him talk. When he was done, I said, "I don't need an apology for last night. Last night was just one night. I need you to understand that it wasn't the first time, and the reason I never told you what I was building is that you never once asked about my life in a way that made me think you actually wanted to know." He was quiet for a long time. I said, "I'm going to keep doing what I do. You can choose what kind of relationship you want to have with me going forward. But I'm not going to make it easy. You don't get to show up now that there's something visible to show up for." He said he understood. I don't know if he did. People understand what they're ready to understand. I had learned that long ago from watching the way he looked at Nathan's failures and found lessons, and looked at my silence and found nothing worth examining. What I know is that I hung up the phone and went to my desk and opened my laptop and started reviewing the closing documents for the acquisition, because the work was still there. And the work didn't care what had happened the night before. And the work had always been the thing I could count on to be exactly what it appeared to be. Wesley asked me how the dinner went when I came into the office that afternoon. I said it was interesting. He raised an eyebrow. I said it turned out my dad didn't know I owned the venue. Wesley was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How'd he take it?" I said I wasn't sure yet. Wesley nodded slowly and went back to the contractor report he'd been reading. That was one of the things I appreciated most about him. He knew when a thing had been said and when there was nothing useful to add. I have thought about that evening many times in the months since. Not with anger, not even with the satisfaction I might have expected. What I feel is something closer to clarity, the particular kind that comes when something you've been carrying for a long time is finally set down, not because someone helped you set it down, but because you simply stopped needing to hold it. My father did not make me tough. He made me invisible, and invisibility taught me toughness, which is a different thing entirely. There is a kind of parent who believes that love means preparing your child for the world as you understand it. My father understood the world as a place where men like Nathan succeeded and people like me were supported quietly and expected to be grateful. He was not cruel in his heart. He was just profoundly wrong in his assumptions, and he never had a reason to examine them until a placard in a lobby forced him to. I don't know what happens next with my family. I've been cautious about optimism. My father has called more often in the past few months, with more actual questions. Questions about the portfolio, about how acquisitions work, about what it's like to manage people and make decisions that carry weight. I answer him honestly. I don't warm to him quickly. I have learned to tell the difference between someone who is trying to understand and someone who is trying to reclaim influence, and I'm still determining which category he falls into. Nathan texted me 2 weeks after the rehearsal dinner. He said he wanted to have coffee. I agreed. We met at a place in Wicker Park on a Sunday morning and sat across from each other with the awkward honesty of people who have known each other too long to pretend but don't yet know how to be real. He said he'd been thinking about what I'd told him in the parking garage. He said he thought I was right. I didn't tell him what a thing it is to hear that. Not just the words, but the stillness he had when he said them. The particular stillness of a person who is telling the truth instead of performing it. We talked for 2 hours. About childhood things I'd never said out loud. About the way he'd absorbed my father's assumptions without questioning them. About the fact that he didn't think he'd been cruel. And I said I believed him, but that not intending harm and causing it are two different things, and the difference matters less to the person who was hurt than to the person who did the hurting. He sat with that. He didn't argue. That surprised me more than anything he said. We still have a long way to go. I'm realistic about that. Years of a pattern don't dissolve in one honest conversation. But there is something there that wasn't there before. An actual willingness to look at what was, which is the only way to build anything different. My mother and I have coffee once a month now. She talks more than she used to. She asks real questions. 2 months ago, she asked me what it was like to close a big deal, and I told her. And she listened. Actually listened, not in the way she used to listen when she was waiting for a pause to redirect the conversation. Just listened. I let myself feel how much that mattered. I didn't pretend it didn't, but here is what I want to say, because it is the thing I keep coming back to, the thing underneath all the rest of it. I was in that building because of my own work. Every choice that led me to that Thursday night in that ballroom came from decisions I made alone, with no support from the people who were supposed to want good things for me. The placard existed because of 9 years of early mornings and difficult phone calls and problems I solved by myself, when there was nobody to call and nothing to fall back on except my own determination that I would not be what my father believed me to be. The charity case owns the building, not because she needed to prove something. Because she found the work she was supposed to do and she did it year after year, without applause, without recognition, without anyone in her family ever once asking if she needed help, or if she was okay, or if she was happy. She is. That's the part that matters. Not my father's face when he came back from the lobby. Not the phone call the next morning. Not even the coffee with my brother as much as it meant. The part that matters is that I built something real, and it will stand whether they acknowledge it or not, and there is a freedom in that kind of truth that I would not trade for anything they could have given me. Not even the photograph. The one my father took of Nathan in his office chair 8 years old and framed and placed on his desk. The one I was not in. I have thought about that photograph more times than I can count. For years, it was a wound. Then it became a question. Then it became a compass, the thing that showed me where I was and, more importantly, what direction I needed to walk. I don't need to be in that photograph. I have my own. There's something nobody tells you about being underestimated by the people who raised you. It doesn't just hurt, it teaches. And what it teaches you depends entirely on what you decide to do with the silence they leave you in. My father never meant to give me anything useful. He meant to dismiss me. He did it casually, the way people do things they've practiced so long they've stopped noticing. A joke at a dinner table, a name that was supposed to be harmless, a laugh from a room full of people who didn't know any better. The family charity case. Said out loud into a microphone at my brother's rehearsal dinner in a building that I owned. That's the part that still gets me when I think about it. Not the cruelty of it, the precision of the irony. Every single choice I ever made. Leaving school, taking Barbara's loan, driving to that Southside complex at 20 years old with $11,000 and no backup plan. Every one of those choices led me to that room. Led me to the placard in the lobby with my name on it. Led me to the moment when Nathan walked back from the restroom with a different face and leaned over to whisper something to my father that changed the architecture of our family in about 45 seconds. I didn't plan that. I want to be clear about that. There was no scheme. I wasn't engineering a moment. I was just living my life, the one I'd built out of the raw material of their indifference. And the truth showed up on its own, because that's what truth does when you've been building it long enough. It becomes impossible to hide. What I've come to believe, not from anyone who taught me, but from 9 years of early mornings and hard decisions and problems I solved alone, is that there are two kinds of people in every difficult situation. There are people who look at what's in front of them and decide what it means based on what they already believe. And there are people who look at what's in front of them and ask what's actually true. My father was the first kind. He looked at me and saw confirmation. Quiet girl, no degree, working in property management, whatever that meant. He never asked a follow-up question. He never needed to. He already knew what I was. Wesley was the second kind. He looked at 20-year-old with a spreadsheet and a loan and a building that needed work, and he asked one question: do you actually know what you're doing? I said I was learning. He said that's the right answer. We shook hands and we built something together. The difference between those two men is the difference between a ceiling and a foundation. What I want anyone to take from this: if you're the person in your family who was never prepared for anything, never photographed in the right chair, never brought along on the trips that mattered, is that the absence of someone's belief in you is not evidence that you're wrong about yourself. It's evidence about them, about the limits of what they could see. And limits are not verdicts. You build in the space they leave you. You build without applause, because the work doesn't require applause to be real. You make hard choices and you learn from the ones that don't work. And you keep going, not because anyone is watching, but because the work itself is worth doing. And one day, maybe, the truth shows up in a lobby, with your name on it, in clean professional print, right where anyone who thought to look could read it. My father called the next morning. My brother asked for coffee. My mother actually listened, for the first time in a long time. I didn't need any of that to know what I'd built. But I won't pretend it didn't matter. It mattered. It just mattered differently than I thought it would when I was younger, not as proof, but as permission. Permission to stop carrying the weight of their misunderstanding and let the work speak for itself. The charity case owns the building. She always did. They just weren't paying attention.